Hey there. Tonight we begin with something softer. Not a tale of knights or castles, but of bread dough and muddy boots, of slow glances exchanged under willow trees, and the quiet rustle of linen as it dried beside the river. This is the kind of story that doesn't make it into epic poems, and maybe that's exactly why it's worth telling. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Our story begins just after sunrise. Sometime in the mid-1100s, in a nameless village nestled somewhere in the folds of a medieval European countryside. It could be in Saxony, or the hills of Burgundy, or the misty valleys of Bohemia. But it hardly matters. These places all shared something familiar. The clink of wooden buckets at the well, the smell of turnips and rye, and the quiet longing that sometimes bloomed between two people with calloused hands and sunburned necks. This was not a world of romantic confessions or long horseback chases. In fact, saying too much could be dangerous. The church had strict opinions, fathers even stricter, and in a place where survival often depended on keeping your head down and your hands busy, love, the tender kind, had to slip in sideways. If you lived in such a village, you likely woke before the birds. You'd step out of a timber cottage, roofed with thatch and smoke streaked from the hearth. Dew would still cling to the grass, and your feet, more often than not, would be bare. In the mornings, before the heat rose, young women might go to the village well, carrying clay jugs or wooden pails, sometimes with younger siblings in tow. It was, without anyone saying it aloud, a kind of social gathering, but also one where eyes did more work than mouths. The well was a natural point of contact. Young men, bringing grain sacks for milling or leading geese down the lane, would pass through casually, they'd say, perhaps timing their errands just so. Maybe one boy adjusted his tunic, combed his hair with fingers damp from the dew. Maybe one girl tied a ribbon that wasn't strictly necessary. Love here didn't shout. It nodded once, then looked away. It waited for Beltane, or midsummer, when music would play and cider might loosen a tongue. But even then, courtship was rarely private. It was threaded through with obligation to parents, to dowries, to land. Still, among the mundane movements of daily life, small acts stood out, like when a boy dropped an extra fish at a family's doorstep, or when a girl added a second sprig of mint to a barley stew shared after church. There were customs, of course, and each region had its own slow choreography. In parts of England and the Low Countries, bundling existed, a strange, awkward ritual where two young people might lie next to each other under watchful eyes, wrapped in separate cloth sacks or separated by a board to talk through the night. It wasn't romantic, exactly, but it was a permitted closeness, a way for two people to assess one another within the boundaries of community expectation. But such practices weren't universal. In most places, courting was subtle and oddly seasonal. Winter wasn't ideal unless you could find excuses to visit for firewood or stew. Spring, with its feast days and longer light, gave more chances. And summer, well, summer was the season of work, of threshing and hay cutting, but also of chance encounters in the fields. Hands brushing during harvest, sharing a ladle of water from the same gourd, pausing to adjust a scythe, and catching a glance you weren't supposed to hold for too long. Of course, love wasn't always new. Many young couples had known each other since they were toddlers. Their parents might have swapped eggs or ale for years, but something would shift one year. The way she rolled her sleeves, the way he started speaking more slowly, that notice Others would too. And sometimes families would begin to plan. But plans didn't always mean consent. In truth, a peasant girl in the 12th century had few ways to resist a proposed match, especially if it secured a bit more barley land or helped a brother pay off a tithe. And for boys, it wasn't much easier. If the father said no, that was it. Still, some couples persisted. There were stories, slow, quiet ones, of those who waited or ran, or bent the rules just enough to end up in the same household. One of the most telling signs of affection came through gifts, but these weren't roses or poems, more like a finely carved wooden spoon, a better than average woolen thread, a lump of beeswax, or, in rare cases, a chicken plump and bartered for in secret. These weren't grand gestures, but they mattered. A boy might spend a week smoothing a comb from birch wood. He'd wait for a moment when her father wasn't looking, then leave it near her loom. And sometimes affection left no gifts, just a rhythm. He'd pass by her cottage every morning. She'd bake 2 oatcakes instead of 1. Maybe he taught her younger brother how to patch a fence. Maybe she mended his sister's apron. There was no announcement, just repetition. That's how most love began in villages like this, through 100 repetitions. But repetition didn't guarantee safety. If a couple was caught acting improperly before a marriage was arranged, well, the consequences ranged from verbal scolding by the priest to public humiliation in the stocks. And in cases where class differences existed, say, a villain's daughter and a reeve's son, things could turn sour fast. The church kept close watch over behavior, and the social order didn't enjoy disruptions. Still, love pressed on, quietly like moss through stone, like a whisper under the clatter of threshing tools. It wasn't poetic most of the time, but it was real, and even centuries later, scraps of it remain in old manorial court records, in songs collected by wandering friars, in local legends, about ghostly lovers who never quite made it to the altar. So if you were to stand beside that village well, long after everyone had gone home, you might hear a faint echo of laughter that didn't quite belong to the present, or a footstep that paused too long by the bucket's rope. You might not notice it, but they were there. To people who once exchanged a glance over a ladle of cold water, and decided, without words, to keep noticing each other. And maybe they never married, maybe they did, but they remembered. That much is certain now, as the morning turns to midday. In our little village, and the scent of damp earth rises from the fields, we'll leave the two of them to their quiet, slow dance. The village never needed a clock to know when midsummer had arrived. You could smell it, damp hay, roasted onions, sweat, the smoke from the first bonfires curling over distant rooftops, and more than anything else, the quiet hum of possibility. Because if love in the medieval village was normally confined to passing glances and well-timed errands, then midsummer was the one moment it was allowed to come up for air. This was when everything loosened just a little, not undone, not wild, but relaxed. Enough that an unmarried girl might wear her hair down, or a boy might dance without his father's direct supervision. The church had a wary relationship with such festivals, trying to shepherd their meanings towards saints' days and harmless community gathering. But underneath it all, the old customs still lingered, like shadows that refused to go entirely. The villagers' festival didn't involve wine, because wine didn't flow easily into poor hands here. But there was ale, strong and sour, There were turnip pies and oatcakes, and a few hard-earned sausages saved from the winter peg slaughter. And there were riddles. Riddles told around the fire, some so old that no one knew the answers anymore, only that you were supposed to laugh softly, and maybe look in someone's direction while you did. Dancing was the real moment, not the kind you'd imagine from paintings of courtly life with silk shoes and lutes. This was stomping, spinning, dusty-footed movement, fiddles or whatever passed for them, flutes made from river reeds, songs that changed their lyrics every year depending on who had married whom, or who had fallen in the mud last Sunday. For courting couples or almost couples, this was both opportunity and test. You could ask someone to dance, but you had to do it carefully. Not too soon, not too late, not in front of too many eyes, unless your intentions were already known. And then, of course, there was the moment of the shared cup. Some villagers believed, or pretended to believe, that drinking from the same wooden vessel at midsummer sealed a kind of promise, nothing binding, but enough that, come harvest, people might start asking questions. Have you spoken to her father yet? Are you going to build your own cottage next spring? Does she spin or just bake? These questions weren't nosy, exactly, they were practical, because marriage was rarely just about love. It was about whether two families could afford a new roof, or spare a sheep, or if someone had a cousin with a spare strip of barley field. But midsummer, it was when you could forget that for a little while. One young woman, let's call her Anselma, though no one remembers her real name, spun thread at the festival each year. She sat on a stool near the fire, winding flax around her fingers. The other girls teased her for it, because it wasn't exactly festive, but she said it gave her something to do with her hands. The truth, of course, was that she didn't want to seem idle in front of a certain boy, the one who always helped stack firewood near the ale barrels, the one with the missing tooth and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his ribs. He noticed her. He didn't say anything, not directly, but once, when her spool of thread fell into the dirt, he retrieved it without being asked, cleaned it with the edge of his tunic, handed it back without looking at her face. And she, in response, spun it more slowly after that, hoping he might keep watching. But moments like that were fragile, easily interrupted. A single shout from an elder or the accidental arrival of a cousin could break the thread. And so they waited through the end of the song, through the fire crackling down to embers, through the awkward, sleepy silence that followed the last dance. Not everyone had a midsummer like Anselma. Some girls were watched more closely. Some boys had already been told where their futures lay. But even then, small rebellions happened. A song sung with the wrong name in the lyrics. A carved token passed hand to hand beneath the table. A slow, deliberate, not tied in someone's apron ribbon. A silent message that meant, I noticed you, even if I can't say anything now. And when the festival ended, life returned to its earlier rhythm. The grind of the quarnstone, the drips from the barn roof, the aching backs and cracked fingers. But under all of that, those moments stayed. No one spoke about them openly, but they were remembered. One boy in the village, no name survives. Only the shape of his story, built a bench under an ash tree after the midsummer dances ended. He carved it carefully, brought it from the woods himself, set it there without fanfare, and every evening, after the cows were milked and the hens counted, he sat there, sometimes alone, sometimes not. People noticed, but they said nothing. Because, in the end, love wasn't a loud thing in this world. It was a bench under a tree, a thread dropped and picked up again, a shared cup with no kisses, just the taste of someone else's hope on the rim dot. As midsummer passes, and the long days begin to tilt gently toward the harvest, we'll leave Anselma to her spinning, and the boy to his quiet tasks. They've made a beginning, even if neither of them would call it that out loud. Autumn was never sudden in the village. It crept in slowly, like a memory. One morning, the grass didn't dry as quickly. Then the apples turned sweeter and softer. And before long, cloaks were taken out of storage, and the sun sank just a little too early behind the trees. For those whose courtships had quietly begun in spring, passed unnoticed in summer, and trembled beside the midsummer fire, this was the season of waiting. Waiting was something every villager knew. You waited for the frost to pass. You waited for the priest's nod. You waited for the next rain, or the next sowing, or the next moment someone looked at you the same way you'd been looking at them. Anselma, still spinning flax in the evenings, had not yet spoken to the boy, not properly, but he came by now. Not every day, but often enough that it no longer felt like coincidence. He asked about her father's pig, which had broken its tether. He mentioned her cousin's marriage, though he pretended not to know she had one. And once, in a truly bold moment, he offered her a turnip. Not an especially good one, but it was peeled and warm. Still, nothing was promised. They both knew that. The harvest feast was coming soon, and with it, visitors from nearby hamlets. Families looking to match their sons with girls who could pluck a goose and boil cabbage without complaint. And with winter, all things slowed, especially the business of affection, marriage. For most peasants, didn't happen with great ceremony. It happened after Candlemas, sometimes in the thaw of early March, when the world began to stir again. But long before that, things had to be arranged. Permission had to be asked. Dowries whispered about modest ones, often just a sheep or a patch of tilled land. And questions had to be answered. Could she brew? Could he thatch a roof? Was he bound to the land, or free to hire himself out elsewhere? All of this was practical, but beneath it, always, was the gentle pulse of hope. Hope that you might marry someone whose voice you didn't dread. Someone who made the chores feel slightly less tiresome. Someone who knew when to speak and when not to. Someone who remembered the same moment at the well. Sometimes matches like that were made, and sometimes not. One story told years later, by a traveling friar who spent winters taking confessions for salted fish, was of a girl who embroidered a corner of her shift with the initials of a boy, who went off to serve a manor lord in another shire. He never came back. No tragedy, just life. She married someone else. But every Candlemas she wore that same shift, quietly, under wool, never spoke of it. In Anselma's village, things remained uncertain through late autumn. The rains came, then frost. The turnip stores were decent that year, and the barley had been less sour than expected. People were in better moods. That helped. Then one morning, her father said something strange. That boy from the ash tree, he stacks firewood like a man who wants something. Anselma said nothing. Her mother, watching from the doorway, added, if he brings more wood, before next Sunday, you should speak to the priest. That was how it was done. Small signs, interpreted softly. No declarations. No scenes by the first snow. The boy had spoken, not to Anselma, but to her father, as tradition required. He came in the late afternoon, just before supper. Didn't come in, just stood outside with a carved spindle in hand. Poor workmanship, but sincere. Her father said he'd think on it, which meant yes, unless something went wrong. And so the waiting began again. Through Advent, through the huddled evenings, as wool was carded by firelight and the chickens stopped laying. Nothing was promised until Candlemas. That was when the banns would be read, 3 Sundays in a row, with time for any objections to rise. Not that anyone in the village objected. There was little energy for drama in the dark, and Selma kept spinning. He kept stacking wood. They still didn't speak much. But one morning she brought him bread with onion baked, in the good kind, saved from the harvest. And he ate it slowly, watching her not with hunger, but with something quieter. The church would speak of marriage as a sacrament, a union of souls bound before God. But for people like Anselma and the boy from the ash tree, it was something simpler. A shared roof, a warm bowl, and knowing that, as the world turned again and the geese returned to the pond, they would face the next frost together, and maybe, when no one was looking, they would pass each other by the well still, and allow their fingers to brush once more. Just slightly, just enough. So we'll leave them here, as snow falls on the low thatch roofs, and smoke drifts up in thin, pale threads toward the winter sky. Their story never made it into any books, but if you listen closely, you can still hear it in the rhythm of the spindle, in the hush of firewood piled by careful hands, in the quiet promise of a ladle, a loom, and a glance. Sleep well now, and when you wake, we'll wander into another quiet corner of medieval love, this time behind the monastery walls, where even ink began to blush. The stone walls of the scriptorium held their chill long after the morning frost had melted from the cloister paths. It was the kind of cold that settled deep into fingers, a constant companion for anyone tasked with holding a quill or grinding pigment. In one such monastery, not far from the middle Rhine, tucked among winter cabbages and quiet sheepfolds, a young scribe sat at a long bench and began copying the first lines of a homily. He worked in silence, as the rules required, bent over a sheet of scraped parchment. The scratching of his quill was just one among dozens, the sound of obedience, repetition, and endurance. Every monk in the scriptorium had taken vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, each sworn beneath the eye of the abbot. But even in such places, perhaps especially in such places, human longing never truly disappeared. It simply found other roots, other shapes, sometimes. It took the shape of a line copied a little too slowly. A name lingered over in a passage. From the Song of Songs, a tiny flower inked in the margin against the rules, but easy to excuse as a mark of contemplation. Other times, it was something more dangerous. A note slipped into the folded end of a psalter, or a small scrap of parchment buried beneath the wax seals of old correspondence. The young scribe, the records never tell us his name, had been assigned to the scriptorium just a year before. He was not especially fast, nor especially neat, but he was diligent. His letters were a little too wide at the base, his capital G tilted, but he rarely made mistakes. And he never asked questions, which mattered more than anyone admitted. He had not come to the monastery from wealth. His hands had the broad-knuckled look of a farm boy. Likely his family had offered him to the church as a way to spare one more mouth at table or to secure blessings for the harvest. Either way, he took to the rhythms of monastic life without resistance. The bells, the meals, the hours of prayer, the copying. But after 6 months, a change occurred. Subtle at first. His margins grew tighter, his lines more careful. The red ink, reserved for rubrication, appeared more often in his folios, sometimes where it wasn't required. At the end of one sermon by St. Augustine, he added a symbol that no one recognized. A single drop of red in the corner, shaped like a crescent moon, it was noted, then ignored. There were many reasons to write carefully in a monastery: pride, perfection, fear of error. But sometimes there were reasons that came in the form of a visiting novice, a lay brother assigned to assist in the kitchen, perhaps, or deliver grain from the estate lands. Monasteries were not empty places. They were hubs of administration, of education, and often of quiet movement. Boys were sent in for tutoring. Widows' sons were placed for training. Scribes, like the one at our desk, might pass dozens of people each week, all within the rules. All in silence, but not without notice. It's possible that he saw someone during the evening offices. Perhaps someone who also watched him. We don't know, but what we do know from the folios that survive is that his script began to change again. In the margins of sermons, he added lines from the Psalms, carefully selected, each pointing toward longing, loneliness, or joy. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be punished. But for someone who knew where to look, they formed a quiet thread. This was not love as the world usually thinks of it. There were no secret trysts, no broken vows, only glimpses, words written, more for the writer than the reader. But even so, they mattered, because in a world where affection was forbidden, even imagined love carried weight. The abbot may have suspected something. In the records of that year, there is mention of a reshuffling. In the scriptorium, 2 scribes reassigned to different benches, a change in the morning rotation. It's possible the red ink drew attention, or the Psalms, or perhaps nothing happened at all, only the usual watchfulness that came from trying to keep dozens of minds fixed on heaven when they kept drifting elsewhere. The scribe did not stop writing. He continued his copying, but his marginalia changed. The lines grew shorter, the colors returned to black. The final flourish on his letter Q was removed, and then, in one manuscript, a sermon on divine patience, there is a gap, a blank, margin unusually wide, a space where perhaps something had once been written and then scraped clean with a knife. Parchment can be reused. Love cannot. Weeks passed. Seasons turned. His pages resumed their plainness. But in one final manuscript, a set of homilies, now stored in a monastic library in Austria, a scholar in the 1970s found something strange. A faded name, written in the margin in iron gall ink. So faded it could barely be read. Not Latin, not a saint's name, just a name. A name that did not belong in the text. Was it a mistake, a slip, a confession, or just a test of the ink? We'll never know. But we know this much. Ink fades, but someone once wrote it. Now, the lamps in the scriptorium are being snuffed. The pages closed. The silence deepens. And the love that dared not speak above a whisper is once again buried beneath the Psalms. There were rules about ink. It had to be mixed fresh every few days. Iron gall, most often made from crushed oak galls, rainwater, and bits of rusted iron, thick, smelling faintly of vinegar, stored in stoppered pots, wrapped with linen. Every scribe knew how to make it. It was one of the first things a boy learned after being given his habit and his first knife, not for defense, but for sharpening quills and scraping parchment smooth. The ink was meant for sacred words, for copying sermons, epistles, legal records, and saints' lives. But in some monasteries, quietly, irregularly, ink was also used for other things, not forbidden things, exactly, but personal, private, hidden. Some monks kept journals, not many, and never openly, but a few, little scraps tucked behind the covers of books, thin folios of parchment hidden between bindings, lines written during the night hours when the others had gone to sleep and the only light came from the coals. These weren't diaries in the modern sense. There were no long accounts of daily life or introspection, just fragments, a verse, a note, a name, and once in a while, something resembling a letter. To write a letter in a monastery was not unusual. The abbot might dictate correspondence to other monasteries or to local nobility. There were scribes who managed estate records, tithe, tallies, and spiritual reports for Rome. These were official, sealed, and filed. But private letters, those were another matter, especially if they weren't sent. One such letter survives, tucked inside the wooden cover of a 12th century missal, found in the archives of an abbey that no longer exists. It was discovered during a restoration effort in the 1800s, folded into fourths, barely legible. The script is plain, not a trained chancery hand, but the handwriting of someone taught well enough to be precise. It is unsigned, unsent, and unaddressed. The letter reads, in part, "You walked past me with the bowl of water, and I did not lift my eyes. Not because I did not want to, but because I did. The wind caught the end of your sleeve and carried it across the stones like a banner. I think of that more than I should. I have asked God to take the thought from me. He has not. There is more, but the rest has faded beyond reading. Some say it was never meant to be delivered. Others think it may have been and then returned. Either way, the letter was hidden, not destroyed. That matters. Writing something down was dangerous. It made a moment real, and if someone else read it, it could be taken as evidence of impropriety, of pride, of a heart turned toward worldly things. But it also meant that the feeling had been shaped into words, and in a world built entirely on words, divine, legal, scriptural, that meant something. The scribe we followed earlier may never have written a letter like that, but perhaps he read one. Perhaps he saw another monk with ink on his fingers, during a time of day when no copying was permitted. Perhaps he once found a scrap of parchment near the ash pit and did not tell anyone. Or perhaps he did. What many did, carved his feelings into patterns so small and private they could barely be recognized. The curl of a certain letter, the rhythm of a borrowed psalm, the repetition of a flower motif that had no business in the margins of a penitential prayer. Love, in the monastery, was never named, but it showed itself in the care taken over simple things. A line written 3 times to get the slope just right, a book bound with smoother leather than required, a prayer copied with extra spacing, as if to let the silence breathe. Sometimes these gestures were not even romantic. They were gestures of friendship, of quiet loyalty, of wordless companionship. But in a world where no personal attachments were encouraged, even these were subversive. There is one more story from this world, from an abbey farther east, where records mention a monk named Irembert, who was punished not for heresy, not for disobedience, but for excessive tenderness toward a brother. The record doesn't explain what that meant. No dates, no description, only the phrase, moved to the lower cloister and denied ink for a season. Denied ink, not food, not prayer, but ink that says something. Ink was more than a tool. It was a kind of speech, a medium through which the mind could reach beyond itself. To be denied it was to be silenced, and yet the margins remained. Scholars today who study medieval manuscripts often find strange notations in the corners of pages, small drawings, half-finished words, initials crossed out. Some of these are idle doodles, some are practice lines, but some, just some, are personal. A faint heart shape, scratched into the leather of a book cover, a name written in the gutter of a page, where no reader would ever look, a prayer written in Latin that asks not for salvation, but for understanding. This was how love survived behind the monastery walls, not loudly, not rebelliously, but patiently, through ink, through silence, through the quiet act of caring too much about a line of text. As the bells ring for compline, and the scribes lay down their quills for the night, we close this page as well. The ink has dried, the candle gutters low, and whatever was felt behind those stone walls, it remains soft, slow, and nearly forgotten. There came a time, every so often, when the monastery cleaned its shelves, not for dust, though there was plenty, but for order. Old ledgers were scraped clean and used again. Cracked bindings were torn off and stitched anew. Letters that no longer held value were pressed into kindling. Blank folios with torn corners were cut down into bookmarks. Even parchment was not sacred unless it still served its purpose. One such cleaning took place in the winter of 1171. According to a brittle account in the abbey's record book, inventory reordered, psalters reassigned, letters unclaimed, burned by prior's order, all ink recorded. It is a single line, a footnote in a year, marked otherwise by a late barley harvest and a broken roof beam in the guest hall. But that simple sentence, letters unclaimed, burned, holds more than it admits. Because in monasteries across Europe, hundreds of such letters had gathered over decades. Some were missives from bishops, others were family updates, petitions, or confessions, but some were never meant to arrive, or never meant to be read. They sat bundled in drawers, tied with linen, or folded into the covers of books, quiet collections of unsent or unanswered thoughts, sometimes written by monks who no longer lived at the monastery, sometimes addressed to people whose names no one remembered. But when the time came for cleaning, they were judged silently, and burned. In one monastery, they did so at night. It's not clear why. Perhaps the fire drew too much attention in the daylight, or perhaps some of the brothers preferred not to see the names fade. No records survive of what was in those letters. Only hints remain in the careful copying of verses that no longer matched the sermons they were attached to, in the unexplained gaps in certain chronicles, in the abrupt ending of correspondence from one scribe whose hand had appeared faithfully for 20 years and then stopped. The boy we followed, the one who once wrote a name in the margin, may have seen such a burning. He may have helped carry the basket of folded parchment to the courtyard. Perhaps he even recognized his own handwriting among them, or perhaps he recognized someone else's. It's not hard to imagine the fire, a small one, perhaps in the old brazier, flames low, smoke heavy, the crackle of parchment as it curled inward, blackening quickly. Ink doesn't scream when it burns, it just goes dark. And names written, carefully, painfully, vanish in silence. this was not punishment. Not exactly. It was administration, order. The monastery was, above all, a place of structure, vows, schedules, purpose. There was no room for loose ends. And so the letters, even those never sent, were erased. But not everything can be burned. Some scribes left behind other traces, not in words, but in the care they gave to their final work. A sermon copied with near-perfect lines, bordered with faded green ink that had no liturgical purpose. A book of hours with an extra page inserted between two expected ones, blank, save for a single line from the Song of Songs, in a hand smaller than usual. I sought him whom my soul loveth. These things were not destroyed. They were too beautiful, or too carefully disguised, or too integrated to be noticed. They survived, and in rare cases, the scribes themselves survived the silence. Some left the monastery. Not often vows were binding, but occasionally a dispensation was granted. A boy once trained as a scribe might be sent to serve a bishop, or called home by a dying parent, or even very occasionally released. What happened after, no one tracked. Perhaps the letters were written again, or perhaps they were never needed. One story from the Welsh borderlands tells of a scribe who left monastic life and became a schoolteacher, writing psalms on wooden tablets for village children. He never married, but the parish record notes that he took particular care with the teaching of names. Another, from an abbey near Dijon, records a monk who wrote prayers for widows, not formal ones, but private lines meant to be folded and held. The prayers were quiet, unofficial, but treasured. One widow kept hers until she died, and it was found in her bodice, worn thin from touch. There are no great love stories here, no elopements, no rebellions, only traces, and that is the shape love took in these places. Marginal, careful, disguised as devotion, hidden in the act of copying someone else's words, and leaving your own in the breath between lines. The ink fades, yes. The letters were burned, the names erased, but the margins remain, and in the silent cold of the scriptorium, where the smell of beeswax and old leather still lingers, centuries later, you can still feel it. A hush, a holding back, a story never fully told. Sleep now, if you like, and when you wake, we'll cross from scriptoria to Salaria, from monastic vows to noble expectations, where love wore silk and waited behind tapestries. It began not with a kiss, or a glance, or even a letter, but with a ledger in the chambers of a notary somewhere in Aquitaine, or perhaps a scribal office near the border of Flanders. A clerk sat with a quill and wrote the name of a girl he had never met beside the name of a man twice her age. The ink was precise, the wording careful. Her dowry would include a small estate with 2 windmills, the rights to collect tolls from a bridge, and a wall-producing flock of sheep. His contribution was land, titles, the promise of protection and heirs. Neither the bride nor the groom had spoken yet. That was not unusual. Among the nobility of the Middle Ages, love was not what brought people together. Marriage was transaction. Land wedded to land, titles glued to bloodlines. A noble daughter, no matter how clever or pious or beautiful, was first and foremost a piece of leverage, a well-stitched patch on a growing estate. Her education, if she had any, had prepared her for this. She was taught how to hold a goblet properly, how to sit without slouching, how to show deference to her future mother-in-law. She may have known how to read, especially if she had spent time in a convent. But even if she could decipher Latin prayers, No one expected her to read the contract that decided the shape of her future. And yet, within all this calculation, there were still details. Her father might request that she be allowed to bring one nursemaid and one cat to the new household. He might insist that the bride wear a particular veil, one stitched by her mother's own hand, with tiny pearls along the edge. These were not romantic flourishes. They were tokens of pride, of memory, of identity. The girl, we'll call her Isabeau, though it could have been any name, met her future husband for the first time during a feast. Not a celebration for them, but some other noble gathering, where alliances mingled under banners and wine flowed just enough to keep everyone courteous. He bowed to her. She lowered her eyes. They may have exchanged pleasantries, but no one watched for sparks. They watched for signs of obedience, respect, a willingness to play the role. Afterward, the women gathered separately. Her aunts, her mother, a few older cousins. They explained what to expect, not in great detail, but enough. One whispered, "If he's kind, be grateful." Another, "If he's quiet, don't try to fill the silence." Someone handed her a small bottle of rosewater for scent, not for nerves, and adjusted the fall of her veil. The wedding itself was not elaborate. The church discouraged ostentation, though that rarely stopped anyone. A priest said the words. Witnesses signed their names or made marks. Bread was broken. Wine was blessed. Rings were optional, but veils were not. A noblewoman's veil was more than decoration. It was a sign of transition from daughter to wife, from girl to property holder, from a name on one page to a name on another. There may have been music afterward, soft lute playing, flutes, a psaltery, if someone was feeling ambitious. Isabel likely did not dance much. Dancing, while permitted, was watched carefully. The wrong partner, the wrong rhythm, could provoke gossip, and gossip, for a newly married noblewoman, could be dangerous. The consummation was public, in only the most formal sense, witnessed not directly, but by attendants who stood just close enough to hear the rustle of sheets or the creak of the bed frame. Proof was required, though often it was faked, with a drop of wine or the careful use of a pricked thumb. What mattered was the appearance of legitimacy. Afterward, her world shifted. She was now lady of a new household, not fully in charge. The steward and her mother-in-law held more practical power, but responsible nonetheless. Her task was to produce children, preferably sons, to manage domestic affairs, to receive visitors with grace, and to do so without expressing too much of her own mind. But minds do not go silent, and in the still moments between tasks, when she sat in the solar with her embroidery frame, Isabeau may have remembered the way a certain knight bowed to her, not her husband, but another, one who had brushed her sleeve when reaching for bread at the feast. She might have remembered how he had looked away too quickly. She would never speak of it. Instead, she stitched. Her embroidery told stories, not in words, but in color. Blue for longing, red for loyalty, green for the patience of ivy. She may have sewn a bird with a golden thread, flying between two trees that never quite touched. No one would question the design. Noble marriages endured, because they had to, and occasionally, rarely, affection grew. A shared grief over a lost child, a moment of laughter in the courtyard, a whispered comment during a long mass, but, more often, they were polite arrangements that settled into routine. The Baron rode out to inspect the fields. The lady sat near the hearth, counting spindles and talking softly to her maidservants. And so we leave Isabeau for now. her hands folded over her lap, her veil slightly askew in the afternoon light, the fire behind her crackling softly as a page announces yet another guest. She stands, she smooths her gown, and whatever longing she carries, it remains tucked behind her composed smile and the embroidery hidden beneath her sleeve. In the upper chambers of the manor house, the windows faced north. That meant they stayed cool in summer, but in winter, the cold seeped in even through the shutters. Isabeau's room was modest by noble standards. A heavy bed with carved posts, a chest for linens, a table for her writing tools. Though she rarely wrote, she preferred to trace letters with her finger on the wooden tabletop, out of habit more than purpose. The quill was more her steward's instrument than her own. She had been married for 3 years. By now, she had learned the routine. Her husband, Lord Imrie, rose early when he wasn't travelling. He inspected the stables. He dictated letters. He held court once a month in the great hall, listening to disputes about fences and broken carts. He rarely called for her, and when he did, it was for ceremonial occasions, a feast, a baptism, a formal visit from a nearby knight's family. They spoke kindly to each other, carefully. She addressed him with courtesy, and he responded with approval. There was no cruelty between them, only space. That wasn't uncommon. Most noble marriages were built that way, like stone walls, meant to hold rather than to welcome. Love, if it came, was something built after the fact, like ivy growing. Over the tower walls, long after the stones had been laid, Isabeau spent most of her days in the solar. The room faced the herb garden, and in summer the scent of lavender drifted through the windows. She kept her sewing there and her spindle. She managed accounts when asked, though the steward handled most of it. Her real task, the one everyone waited on, was to bear a child. The first pregnancy ended quietly. The second one, too. No one blamed her, not openly, but there were small signs. The way her mother-in-law stopped bringing her almond sweets. The way the midwife's apprentice was replaced with a more experienced woman from the next village. The prayers at Mass grew more pointed, more carefully phrased for fruitfulness and peace in the household. She prayed to, but not just for children. Sometimes, when no one else was in the chapel, she prayed for a voice. Not to speak louder, that would have been improper, but just to be heard, without having to earn it. She was not unloved. The servants liked her. She remembered their names. She let the younger ones rest during the hottest parts of the day. Once, she paid a boy's fine when he had dropped a tray and cracked a pitcher. No one knew. She handed the coins to the steward and asked him to say, "It came from the Lord." Her husband never noticed the pitcher, but another man did. He was not of her station. A clerk, one of the many men who came to manage records for the estate, sent by a cousin with church ties. He was not particularly young, nor especially handsome, but he had an easy manner. He bowed properly. He listened carefully, and when Isabeau passed him in the gallery one morning, he said nothing, but his eyes lingered, just a moment too long. She did not respond, not then, not the second time either, but by the third meeting, a brief pause at the chapel door, she allowed herself the smallest nod, a breath more than necessary, and he bowed, very slightly, before stepping aside. That was all in the Middle Ages. That was often as far as it went. Nobles did not trifle openly. Affairs were dangerous, not just morally, but politically. To cast doubt on a lady's fidelity was to cast doubt on her children, and therefore the inheritance. Still, Isabeau began to wait for those moments. a passing glance, a silent presence during a reading in the hall. Once she caught a glimpse of his hand, ink-stained and rough, ungloved. She thought about that hand longer than she should have. Nothing happened, not really, but she began, sewing differently, more deliberately. Her tapestries filled with quieter symbols, not heraldic beasts or vines of victory, but small things, birds with wings outstretched, trees standing apart, a single boat on still water. Her husband never asked about the tapestries. The clerk stayed for a season. Then he left, as clerks often did, sent back to his cousin or on to another household. He left a few notes behind, not to her, but to the steward. Nothing improper, nothing marked. But the morning he departed, she stood by the open window, in the north-facing room, and let the cold air sting her face. She stayed there longer than she should have. Later that day, she retrieved a scrap of embroidery she'd abandoned months before, a white piece, simple linen, with no design yet. Started, she picked it up, then set it down again. That was all. But the moment marked something, a threshold of feeling, a sorrow too quiet to name. In the years that followed, she bore 2 daughters. They lived, the household stabilized. Her husband grew more reserved, but always civil. The steward reported all matters, the priests held regular mass, and the estate earned modestly through sheep and barley. Isabeau continued to embroider, and though no one ever said it aloud, there were servants who noted that the lady often chose blue thread for her border work, even when red was more customary. What love was in that world was rarely known at the time. It arrived too late, or never fully, or it slipped past unspoken, like a breeze through the upper window. Never strong enough to close the shutters, but enough to make you feel it's passing. And so we leave her again in the stillness of that cold room, with one hand resting on the fabric and the other just barely curled, as if holding something too delicate to show. The feast was not for her. It was held in the great hall after a treaty was signed between 2 neighboring lords, one of whom was her husband. The long tables were filled with roasted meat and trenchers of stewed apples. Barrels of ale had been rolled out 2 days earlier. Minstrels tuned their lutes. A jester from Bourges had been hired, though he wasn't very good. Isabeau sat at the high table, beside her husband, dressed in a gown she hadn't worn in years, a soft blue one, with silver sleeves. Her veil was pinned with her mother's brooch. She smiled where expected, lifted her goblet, nodded at each guest presented. To her. She even said a few words to the young lady seated beside her, the daughter of one of the visiting barons, perhaps 16, and clearly unused to the stiffness of noble company. The girl said little, but kept glancing across the hall toward a tall boy seated near the fire. Isabeau watched her quietly. She knew that look. It was like seeing a version of herself, years ago, when she still believed in possibility, before contracts, before stillbirths, before cold rooms and closed shutters. After the feast, the guests dispersed, some to the guest chambers, some to the stables to check on their retainers. Isabeau stayed behind briefly, saying goodnight to a few of the older guests. Her husband had already retired early, as he often did. She made her way slowly down the corridor, toward her chamber, pausing once at the solar. The coals had burned low. She stepped inside anyway. Her embroidery frame was there, just as she'd left it. The work was nearly finished, a border of ivy around a hunting scene commissioned for a cousin's wedding. But she didn't sit to stitch. Instead, She stood near the window, hands folded, listening to the wind shift across the stone. This was how love ended for many noble women. Not in tears, not in scandal, but in quiet, in the settling of things, in the knowledge that the story had played out exactly as expected, and that she had fulfilled her role with dignity. But sometimes, even in that stillness, something else stirred. Later that week, Isabeau walked with her daughters around the edge of the estate. The air smelled of damp soil and new leaves. Her youngest, barely 7, asked if birds ever got tired of flying. Isabeau said yes. That's why they rest in the trees. Her daughter nodded solemnly and picked a sprig of something green from the path. They passed the old tower, mostly unused now. Its upper floors had been abandoned after a fire years ago. One shutter hung crookedly, tapping against the stone, at home that night. Isabeau retrieved a folded square of parchment from her linen chest. It was not sealed. It had no writing on it, just a fold from years ago when she had thought, for a moment, that she might write something to someone. She had never done it, but she had kept the parchment. She lit a candle, held the parchment to the flame, watched it curl and darken. Then she blew out the candle and sat by the hearth, listening to her children breathing in the next room. Not all noble marriages were empty. Some grew into friendship, some into admiration, others held only duty. But beneath the veils, beyond the vows, behind the tapestries and feast tables, were women like Isabeau, who loved in silence, who stitched their feelings into fabric, and who stood at windows waiting for something that never quite arrived. Wind shifted again. A shutter clicked shut. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and then went quiet. And that is where we leave her. Not alone, but not fully seen. Not sorrowful, but not content. Just steady, unmoving. A quiet figure behind the tapestry of history, forgotten by name, but present in the threadwork. Sleep now. And next, we'll leave behind the manors and chapels and step into something less expected. A cart's jostle, a calloused hand, a string of beads passed between travellers. The road stretched out dusty, and unending beneath a sky heavy with afternoon haze. Pilgrims, clad in homespun cloaks and worn leather boots, moved slowly along the uneven path, their footsteps stirring little clouds of earth. It was not a road for haste, nor for spectacle. It was a road for endurance, for quiet prayer, and for whispered companionship in the early Middle Ages. Pilgrimages were one of the few reasons common folk travelled far beyond their villages. The journey was often long weeks or months spent walking between sacred sites like Canterbury, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. Roads were uneven tracks. Travellers shared food and shelter in sparse inns or under open skies, and safety was never guaranteed. Yet, despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, bonds often formed between strangers. One such journey began with a small group leaving a village in the Welsh marches. Among them was Alfran, a woman no longer young but not yet old, carrying a small bundle of herbs and a worn psalter. Her husband had died the previous winter, and she walked to seek healing prayers at a shrine hundreds of miles away. Travelling beside her was Wulfric, a quiet man from a neighbouring hamlet who had come to fulfill a vow made after surviving a fever. He carried a walking staff and a wooden cross carved by his own hands. Their paths might have never crossed, but fate had other plans. Days passed slowly. At night, they gathered around modest fires, sharing bread dipped in watered wine and tales of homes left behind, Words were few. Silence often filled the spaces between prayers. But in the stillness, glances were exchanged, hands brushed as they passed a shared bowl, and smiles slipped quietly into the darkness. The pilgrims had little need for grand declarations or urgent gestures. Love on the road was a slow unfolding, a warmth found in the simple act of walking side by side through mud and dust, in the steady presence of another human soul against the vastness of the journey. Alfred and Wulfric spoke once, on a morning, when the sky was grey and the rain threatened but never fell. She asked him about the carving on his cross, and he told her it was of Saint Cuthbert, protector of travellers. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the pale light, and offered him some of her herbs for strength. No promises were made, no vows exchanged, just a shared moment of kindness that neither expected but both welcomed. This was love, not of stories or songs, but of quiet companionship, the kind that could survive 1,000 miles of stone and shadow, of worn boots and whispered prayers. As the road rolled onward, and the chapel bells of distant shrines faintly called pilgrims home, their journey continued slow, steady, and unhurried. The road was unpredictable. Some days the sun shone harshly, turning the dirt path into a cracked ribbon stretching to the horizon. Other days, rain came suddenly, drumming on the travelers' worn cloaks and turning the ground into a slick, treacherous mess. Shelters were scarce and often no more than lean-tos or barns thrown open to travelers for a night. On such nights, the pilgrims gathered closely, huddled around small fires that did little to chase away the damp chill. Food was always simple coarse bread, salted cheese, sometimes a shared pot of pottage, if luck or charity allowed. The taste was often bland, but the act of sharing it was a ritual that wove strangers together. Thread by quiet thread, Alfred and Wulfric found themselves seated beside one another beneath a low thatched roof, the heat from the fire painting, their faces orange. She offered him a piece of bread, torn from her own rough loaf. He accepted it with a nod, their fingers briefly touching, a fleeting contact that neither hurried to withdraw. They spoke little, not out of shyness, but because the silence was comfortable a space for thoughts too delicate for words. In the shadows, where others' voices hushed, they exchanged glances that held unspoken stories. Perhaps they remembered lost families or abandoned homes. Perhaps they wondered what the future held once the pilgrimage ended. Their companions in the group rarely noticed. Pilgrimages brought together people from different villages and classes: farmers, minor nobles, clerics, tradesmen, all walking the same road but caught in their own rhythms. It was common for temporary friendships to form, only to dissolve when the next bend in the path pulled travelers apart. Yet for Alfred and Wulfric, there was something steadier, the slow unfolding of shared burdens, tending blisters, helping, steady a weary step, passing along a wrapped bundle of herbs for aching limbs. Their closeness was a quiet defiance of the loneliness that often swallowed those who walked the road. When dawn came, it found them preparing to move again, the air thick with mist and the scent of wet earth. Wulfric adjusted his cloak and offered Alfred his walking staff to steady herself on the uneven path. She accepted it with a grateful smile, their fingers lingering just a moment longer. It was not a grand gesture. There was no rush, no fiery passion, just the steady heartbeat of two people who found in each other a fragile sanctuary amid the uncertainty of their journey. And as the road stretched on, long and winding beneath the softening sky, the bond between them grew not marked by declarations, but by the gentle constancy of presence. Sleep now, and let your thoughts wander with the pilgrims down dusty paths and beneath quiet stars, where love grows not in haste, but in the slow unfolding of shared steps. The road finally curved toward a small chapel, its stone walls weathered and softened by centuries of wind and rain. The pilgrims slowed, their steps growing heavier with fatigue, but also with a sense of nearing the journey's purpose. For many, this place was the end, a sacred site to offer prayers, light candles, and seek solace. Alfred and Wulfric arrived together, their faces sunburned and hands cracked from months of travel. They found seats near the back of the chapel, where the flickering candlelight made the shadows dance softly on the worn pews. The air inside smelled of old wood, incense, and a faint trace of beeswax from candles long ago melted down and relit. There was no grand greeting, no whispered promises or dramatic confessions. Instead, they shared a simple smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the path they had walked side by side. Together, they bowed their heads in prayer, their hearts carrying the weight of hopes and memories that could not easily be spoken aloud in those moments. The bonds forged through dusty miles and cold nights found their meaning. Love had not been shouted or declared. It had grown patiently, like the moss on the chapel's stone, slow, soft, and almost invisible, yet steadfast. When the service ended, the pilgrims began to disperse. Some returned home by different roads, others lingered to rest or to work at the shrine. Alfred and Wulfric stood outside beneath a sky now washed clean by rain, the cool air heavy with the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. They parted without words, no grand farewell, no promises to meet again, just a hand lightly touching a shoulder, a nod, and then the turning of steps in separate directions. Theirs was a love shaped by the journey, by quiet companionship, and by the shared understanding that some connections are meant to be brief, yet deeply held. As night fell, the chapel bell tolled softly in the distance, carrying the sound across fields and villages, a gentle reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, love can be found in the steady pace of footsteps, the passing of a loaf of bread, the silent prayers beneath the stars. And so we close this story. The road continues, long and winding, just as love does, sometimes hidden, sometimes revealed, but always quietly present. Rest now, and when you wake, may your heart carry the calm and patient rhythm of those long ago pilgrims, walking softly beneath the endless sky.